Pogo. When Peggy announced the theme for this year, I knew exactly the story that was called for. In December of 1924, the Danish explorer Peter Freuchen was guiding a couple of Danish scientists along the Arctic Circle in northern Canada, beyond Hudson Bay. They had been traveling in the dark for quite some time in the 40 to 60 degrees below zero cold. And they were tired, weather-beaten, and probably looking to expand their social circle just a little bit. And Christmas was upon them. So Freuchen had the idea that they should spend the holiday at the trading post at Repulse Bay, the nearest thing to civilization for a couple hundred miles in any given direction. I say civilization, but when they located the place, what they found were towering snowdrifts that disguised the existence of about 7 wooden frame buildings. But there were signs of habitation because there were a couple of chimneys that stuck through the high drifts and there was smoke hanging low over the drifts. There were also crisscrossing sled tracks and the tracks of dogs. Oh, and dogs themselves kind of draped over sleds outside. And a couple of Inuit children heavily bundled, laughing and playing. So they asked one of the boys after with the whereabouts of the person they had come to see. A larger-in-life character, originally from Martha's Vineyard, by the name of Captain George Gibbs Cleveland. So the boy announced their presence outside, and Captain Cleveland came out of one of the snow tunnels that connected the wooden buildings, and his face lit up. Apparently, he was ready for a couple more people to talk to as well. So he gave them a warm welcome. And the welcome only got warmer when, over their first meal together, Freuchen asked if it would be permissible if he went out to their sled and brought in one of the bottles of aquavit, Danish schnapps that they had brought along with them. And Cleveland responded, "By all means. Liquor's my favorite drink. Any kind, any brand. And they're few and far between the bottles of it we see around here." So the bottle was retrieved from the sled. It was poured, and they got along famously. And eventually the evening drew to a close. The next day was Christmas. And when they reconvened in the morning, Cleveland announced, "Gentlemen, your visit here for the holiday warms my heart. So in your honor and to celebrate our Savior's birth, I plan to prepare for you a Christmas dinner of 8 courses, no more, no less. But to ready myself for such an endeavor and to begin the celebration, I think we ought to have another drop of that Nordic firewater you brought along." So the bottle, or perhaps it was the second bottle, was brought back out and glasses were poured, and Cleveland began to regale them with stories. He said, "You're probably wondering how I wound up in this particular corner of nowhere in the first place. Well, I was a lad of 24. I was going down the street in New Bedford, Massachusetts, making my way between watering holes, minding my own business, when I was clubbed over the head and woke up to find myself trussed like a pig in the whaling ship A.R. Tucker, a 3-masted brig bound for the Davis Strait. Well, I couldn't get off, couldn't turn around, so I spent the next 17 months with the rest of the crew hunting bowhead whales in Hudson Bay. That's how it all began. Then he told a couple more clarifying anecdotes and finally set down his glass, stood up and said, "Well, gentlemen, we must get started, for I'm going to prepare for you a Christmas dinner of 5 courses, no more, no less." And then his glance fell upon his empty glass sitting there on the table, as if he were seeing it for the first time, as if it had been placed there by Providence. And so, like it was Groundhog Day, he said, "But to ready myself for such an endeavor and to begin the celebration, I think we ought to start with another drop of that Danish schnapps you brought along with you." And so he poured his own glass and passed the bottle to his right. And then he said, "Did I ever tell you how I wound up in this particular corner of paradise? Probably not." And then he continued the story from before, when he finally returned to Martha's Vineyard after that initial whaling expedition. He kept his head low, looked for local work, but then made the mistake of going back to that den of iniquity, New Bedford, Massachusetts, and ended up clubbed over the back of the head, shanghaied to the North Atlantic yet again. And when he returned from that whaling expedition, he was very sure he wanted to leave whaling behind for good. But he found he no longer fit in polite New England society, and he had caught the Arctic bug. So he managed to get himself, on the basis of experience, hired by a trading company to return to the north edge of Hudson Bay, to Repulse Bay, to start a fur trading operation. And he concluded by saying, "And through thick and thin, sometimes more thin than thick, this is where I've been ever since." And then he stood back up and said, "Well, you boys have kept me from my work long enough, for I'm going to prepare for you a Christmas dinner of 3 courses, no more and no less. And when I get done, you can go back to your homeland and tell your compatriots that you met one of the finest cooks in all the world in a remote outpost in Arctic Canada." But before I begin, Peter, I owe you an answer to that question you asked me a while ago. Yes, I am indeed related to the 22nd and 24th Chief Executive of the United States, President Cleveland. It seems we have a common ancestor. Moses Cleveland was born in Woburn, Massachusetts in 1651. On October the 4th of 1676, he was married to Anne Norton, also of Woburn. Together, they had 9 children between them. And he kept going, extending himself on an expansive family history that was exquisite and excruciating in its detail. It would have made a Mormon proud. And as he wound to a conclusion, he said, "So, you see, By my calculations, President Cleveland and I are 9th cousins 2 times removed. And then he stood up again. And by this time, he was wobbling a fair amount. And his guests were beginning to lose patience with him, as some of you may be beginning to lose patience with me. And one of the scientists volunteered that he himself could cook the Christmas dinner, but Cleveland wasn't having any of it. He said, "No, sir, I'm your host, and as your host, I will cook for you. But I know that you gentlemen don't stand on ceremony. You're down-to-earth fellas, and so am I. So I am going to prepare for you a Christmas dinner of a single course. But it will be a caribou roast like nothing you ever tasted before." Now, the trouble was that said caribou roast was in the entryway, partially thawed, but it needed to be brought all the way into the house. And here, Captain Cleveland made a tactical error. You see, he poured himself a couple more fingers of aquavit before he brought in the meat. And he started on another circuitous tale, but Freuchen finally managed to reel him in and get him stood up and walk him into the kitchen, at which point they discovered that the meat had not come into the kitchen by itself. Cleveland said, "Not to worry, it can finish thawing as it roasts." So he put it in the pan, slid it into the oven, and went back into the other room to continue bending the elbow and flapping the jaw. But that was finally interrupted by the smell of something burning. So Cleveland and Freuchen ran into the kitchen to find it full of smoke, but they rescued the roast from the oven. And Cleveland seized his sharpest knife, and with an expertise that suggested he had performed a similar operation before, he carved off the blackened bits and then put the somewhat reduced roast back into the oven. Where it finished cooking, I'm happy to report that when it was finally delivered to the table and sliced up and served out on every plate, it was indeed the most succulent caribou roast that any there present had ever tasted. And as they thought about it, the men realized that if you considered each of the stories he had told them individual courses, that he had more than complied with his initial promise of a multi-course meal. And they all agreed it was a most memorable occasion, which it must have been, because here we are recounting it yet again, almost exactly 100 years later. So, my hope for all of you is that when you sit down for your holiday meal, that there are just the right number of courses served and the proper number of stories told, and that you get a sufficiency of your favorite beverage, no more and no less. And I'm sure that it will all be worth the wait.